Hi, and welcome to this G News update about what's going on around the traps. Well, first of all, as many of you know, at 10:45 this morning, the Statistics Department released new CPI inflation figures which showed that under Christopher Luxon and the stewardship of Nicola Willis, inflation is back up. And it's not just imported inflation or inflation where we face competition, which is up, but it's also the non-tradable inflation, which we don't face any foreign competition for back home. Some people call it domestic inflation. That's back up too. And it's the domestic inflation which had always been thought of as being persistently high and the real worry. So despite all of the cuts, the savagery, and the unnecessary austerity that's being applied by Nicola Willis and her very, very cruel fiscal envelopes from budget to budget, inflation is still really not quite back in the box. It's tending back upwards, and we've got a very uncertain world. Here are the key facts. CPI inflation for all groups was up 0.9% over the last quarter, bringing the annual inflation up to 2.5% from 2.2%. As you can see here, the non-tradable inflation rose by 1.1% in the last quarter, and we've got an annual percentage change of 4%, which is still too high. So that's the territory and responsibility of Nicola Willis, and it's still out of the box. It's not back down in the range where we'd want it, between 1% and 3%, despite Christopher Luxon telling us that inflation is actually back in the box and that it's all about green shoots and everything's fine because his plan is working. He's got no idea what's going on. For example, it's been the case that in Parliament, Christopher Luxon has persistently argued that rents are stabled, and that's been seen as a big lie by Chloe Swarbrick from the Greens, who has challenged him in Parliament on many occasions about this now. But persistently, Christopher Luxon says, no, rents are stable. But today, as you can see from Statistics Department, rents are one of the biggest drivers, actually the biggest driver of domestic inflation. Rates are also on the rise, and they're a big driver of inflation. And remember that Water Done Well by the National Party is using more expensive money, and this has led to a whole bunch of councils having to put up rates, and so rates have actually had an effect on inflation, and inflation ultimately has an effect on the OCR, although commentators are saying this kind of increase right now may not make any difference to the track of the OCR for the Reserve Bank. It just might in time, because we're seeing all sorts of things happening at the moment. There's a great deal of uncertainty, and so nobody can really be too sure what's going to happen next. In other news around the traps, yesterday Craig Rennie started his very first podcast of his own, which I think is called Locked Out, that's produced by Doc Studios, the same people that produce BHN. And in that he had a researcher come on, a guy with the surname Miller, who was extremely knowledgeable about the electricity sector, and he knew all of the stats and done all the research, and he produced a number of graphs. This graph prepared by Edward Miller for Craig Rennie on his new podcast Locked Out shows two lines. The dark line that goes up in 2011 and then comes back down is investment, and that shows that once we privatised, where that dotted dashed line down there next to 2013 is, we ceased to invest anything right across the electricity sector from 2013, from privatisation, all the way through to about 2020. And that other line, the more light-coloured line, is the dividends that were paid out to shareholders. So here's a pattern that shows privatisation led to paying way more of your power bills towards the shareholder dividends, whilst There was hardly any investment in renewables. There was nobody listening to climate change. There were consented wind farms everywhere lying around. Consent wasn't the problem. It was the fact that shareholders and the market had no incentive to do anything but to keep making money. And this is privatisation. And it should be remembered that none of the public wanted John Key's privatisation, but National Party voters thought it would be a tremendous idea to increase the price of your electricity. And so today, your electricity prices are actually going up in order to pay big fat cat shareholder dividends. Those people that are already very well off need more money, and you are going to have to pay them every time you pay your power bill now. And it's being ratcheted up by 10% or more, and that's to keep the fat and the rich fat and rich. In other news, it's been revealed today by the New Zealand Herald that Hamish Campbell, National Party MP, who had previously said that he had a little bit of a connection to the religious group that has been investigated by the FBI over child abuse allegations, and now it turns out that multiple sources have said that he's actually an elder in that church. And this has made Mr. Campbell come forward and say, well, look, actually, I'm a member, and yes, I've had quite a number of meetings in my home. So that story is developing and seems to have a little bit more to it than may have first been the case. Finally, the big news in the last couple of days has really been Simeon Brown and his attacks on doctors. A Northland doctor named Gary Payender had appeared on BHN last night, and he released a truth bomb about how doctors are paid on a scale from about 185k, and every year they could progress or not until they're a senior doctor. But he laid out the facts that it takes about 13 years to become a specialist, and you have to work really hard, unlike Simeon Brown, who actually only had a couple of years in a bank as some kind of clerk, and then did I think it was just a graduate degree in business studies. So for Simeon Brown to be on a cabinet minister's salary at the moment and shooting off his mouth at other people who have worked a lot harder and a lot more qualified than him and of a lot more value to society is pretty rank. And I don't think most of the public really agree with Simeon Brown's attempts to turn people against doctors here. I think they see that the doctors are doing their very best and working in incredible stress with hospitals that are understaffed, and that the government is hopeless and trying to blame people, pass things off, and distract people with plans that aren't even really plans. This $20 billion so-called plan that Simeon Brown announced yesterday is really just a set of tables of projects that have been well known for a long time that need infrastructure rebuilds done to them. There's no funding attached to it at the moment. There's no real specific knowledge about who could possibly fund this. And when we talk about the Investor Summit earlier in the year, it turns out that there's been no deals other than Tainui, who kind of forced their way into the entire summit and got about doing things. They're about the only people that have taken some kind of positive action. And the government tried to take credit for that as well, like they do when inflation's coming down. But when inflation's going up, they kind of try and blame somebody else. At the moment, what we're seeing is nobody saying that they want to invest in hospitals in New Zealand, because there's really quite an uncertain future. If the government was to lose power and Labour were to get back in, then they wouldn't really be encouraging people to do PPPs for hospitals, prisons or schools, and they've gone on record to say so. So why is National proceeding with Simeon Brown saying PPPs are in the mix for hospitals? It's just pretty stupid partisan politics, really. As we saw earlier when we talked about the effects of privatisation and how now we're all paying way more for our electricity bills as a result of John Key and the National Party and their fantasy connection to privatising as a way to transfer their risks and their costs off the balance sheet. We're now seeing the same players, but this time Christopher Bishop trying to privatise the building of houses at Kayanga Ora, Simeon Brown trying to privatise all of our health services that are public at the moment so that doctors are incented to go over to private healthcare, and just no training is done anymore because all of the operations that specialists would be training upon in the public hospital system are now being shipped over to the private care system. So, in summary, privatisation hasn't worked in the past. It makes everything more expensive. It adds the cost of paying dividends to shareholders, to all of us, for what should be public services. So it's a really bad idea. National Party voters continue to vote for this. They seem to think it's an incredible job, that it's really good stuff, and that we're getting back on track by privatising, and that cutting other people's jobs and putting them on the scrap heap is a good thing for New Zealand society, driving people offshore and pushing up inflation. At the moment, we're seeing this continual pressure being placed on low-income people by this government, and middle class, working class, and low-income people make up the majority of New Zealanders. Why we don't vote these people out of power in the polls is an insanity. They're making you poorer, and I think you should kind of wake up and vote these people out of power as soon as possible. That's all for this G News update, and I'll see you next time.